news as well now that we're tracking. Belly, thank you for joining us. NewsX is running a campaign inviting voices from around the world for comments on how India can fix its education system, perhaps drawing examples from other countries as well. Today we're being joined by Rachel Wilson, Professor of Social Impact, University of Technology, Sydney. Rachel, thank you for being with us today. What are your thoughts on examinations that carry disproportionate weight for a student's entire career trajectory, much like the high-stakes environment that we see in India with the NEET exam?
So, look, from a research perspective, we know a lot about high-stakes assessment, and we absolutely know for the last 2 decades that very high-stakes assessments tend to disadvantage students who are on the lower attainment end of the scale in terms of knock-on effects on their learning, etc., etc. Obviously, they get very demotivated, and that impacts on their further learning throughout their lifetime. And that brings with it an economic cost, right? So we want really highly educated populaces. And if you operate very high stakes exams, we know what that's going to do to different groups of students. So most systems, are they shifting away from high stakes exams? Yes, a little bit. However, there is a very clear need for high stakes exams if you have limited expenditure on higher education and a lot of demand. Obviously, when you have that situation, the stakes become higher and higher because it's more and more competitive. The psychological impact is heavier and heavier, and it's really not a very desirable situation. How would you fix it? It'd be likely that you would provide more opportunities for higher education participation, as countries like Australia and Canada have done. And then that removes some of the high stakes nature. It allows different forms of assessment to come in because it's less competitive. But in the Indian situation, where you have, this minimal participation in higher education and you have massive demand, in some ways, a large external exam is the only way to deal with that, right? So there isn't an easy assessment fix. What you need to think about is an education system and policy fix, which is about better provision across a larger group of students in terms of higher education.
Now, given the recurring vulnerabilities though, such as paper leaks, which also happen, of single-day, high-stakes standardized testing models, what could be the alternatives looked at, Rachel Wilson?
So, look, three ways that you could address this. One is the participation way, so greater investment or distribution of the investment in higher ed across a larger group. So that's a participation problem, which reduces the high stakes, right? The second thing that you can do is a pathways solution. So a lot of countries now have many pathways into higher education and university study. And this means that, let's say, people don't get in on first round through the high stakes exam approach, that they're able to take other educational paths which then may feed back into university at a different level once they're able to establish, their success as a student, right? So this in particular is very important for widening access to students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, culturally or otherwise disadvantaged. It means that they get a second run at it if they can really show, let's say they miss out on getting into one of the high prestige degrees, medicine or law. They get into an alternative degree, let's say an arts degree, but if they do really well in their first 2 years of study in terms of grades, that provides a pathway to transfer into the program they want. Another pathway example would be someone who fails to get into university at all, but goes and undertakes vocational study, or indeed work placements, and that they are able to establish competencies and learning through that. That of course requires a whole nother assessment framework, but if you have that, then they perform well, that they are given an opportunity to enter university as a more mature student. Now, in some countries, these pathways are, are very numerous and complicated. There is potential for corruption in some of those pathways, but generally they provide a kind of way of redressing some of the problems with the high stakes competitive sorting exam. A third possible solution is to go for a composite assessment system or a portfolio system, and again, we have lots of jurisdictions around the world where this is happening. So students not only complete a single exam on a single day, very high pressure and high stakes, they're able to develop a portfolio of achievement across a range of different exams at different times. They're able to do resits on exams to improve their performance. And those sorts of systems, of course, are viewed as much more sophisticated and fair in terms of the assessment that they give. We do know with the high stakes assessments, for example, that pressure cooker delivery of the exams means that certain students are going to underperform. And there may be some that perform very well in exams. But the question is whether as a nation you want to, just live with that, or whether you want to broadly recognise the potential and contribution of everybody in society and build economic prosperity. So having portfolios, having pathways, and having increased higher education participation are three direct ways to address that issue.
And Professor Wilson, the Indian government now has formed a high-level task force that consists of many big tech experts. Do you believe that this could perhaps help? Do you believe also the online shifting of pen and paper exams could also help plug loopholes and improve the system?
Well, it's a very complicated area. CBT testing is obviously a mode of delivery for the assessment. It's not particularly an assessment design. Like more fulsome assessment design involves, multiple assessments across time, including regular classroom assessments and the judgments of teachers and all that sort of stuff. But given that you have this high stakes exam and it's had security issues, there is potential for CBT to tighten up some of that, but there's also potential for new types of problems, potential errors, and obviously data leaks and potential for corruption. Those sorts of things, exist in the digital world as much as they do in the pen and paper world. Within CBT testing, there have been developments so that we are able to use very large item banks to generate multiple items of equivalent difficulty and send them to different students. So potentially students can be assessed across sort of customised sets of exam questions, which we know to be statistically similar in terms of difficulty and response patterns. So there is potential to tighten up on any sort of paper leaks or content leaks that way, as those tests can be generated, on the day of the exams or at the actual time of exams. They can be instantly generated. That means that, two students sitting next to each other running a computer-based test may actually be getting completely different questions, and in fact some of the designs for assessment arrange that specifically so students aren't able to look over to others and see similar questions on their workspace. So, here again, there are there's potential for tightening up security against cheating, etc. But when it comes to, you know, broader digital security, you can see that there are also a whole lot of risks and threats there, which, you know, may well play out. The clever strategy in assessment is to diversify and to broaden the assessment frameworks within an educational system. We've known good ways to do that for quite some time now. The OECD, for example, made recommendations as to how education systems around the globe can address some of the real challenges in how we assess and monitor student progress. And, you know, that's a whole other conversation. All I'm saying is that the evidence is there. We know the dynamics in relation to these tests, particularly the high stakes exams, and a very easy fix on it is to diversify the assessment system.
All right, Professor Rachel Wilson, thank you very much for joining us with your perspective on this big story. On that note, we're slipping into a short break. Stay with us.